So now we'll get into Protagoras, the first of the avowed sophists. Dates 490 to 420. From Abdera, by the way. So same place that, right there, same place that the Atomists were from. Okay, he's the first one to call himself a sophist. He visited Athens 3 times. He would have been well connected with the political class. In particular, he was well connected with Pericles, probably Athens' most famous politician of the time. He managed to stay in power for like 30 years, I think, which is very amazing for Athens with how quick they turn out those who come to power. Plato's Protagoras is supposed to be a conversation between Socrates and Protagoras on his second visit to Athens. And this dialogue is one of the best things we have to try and reconstruct our view of Protagoras. On his last trip to Athens, he was probably accused of impiety and all his works were burned. Remember that the further we go in time, eventually Pericles is out. It's the same reason Anaxagoras was driven out of Athens. And so anyone who is a friend of Pericles is ultimately not going to be welcome in Athens. How best do I want to say this? So we're going to go over 3 dialogues of Plato's that I'm going to do a somewhat deep dive into. The first one that we're going to do here is Protagoras. The second one that we're going to do is the Apology. And then the last one that we're going to do is a Republic. So this one, Protagoras, we're going to go through it because it's going to give us a sense of a single sophist. We're going to do a deep dive into Protagoras, but he's the only one we're going to do a deep dive into. The other 3 we're going to kind of briefly touch upon. The Apology here is going to be the dialogue of Plato's that gives us a deep dive into Socrates. He's going to be the one we cover after the Sophists. And then the Republic, this is the best representative work of Plato's philosophy. So if you want to see where we're going ahead, these are going to be our 3 major dialogues. And today I'm going to be focusing on this one. So we're going to be doing a somewhat deep dive into this one, largely for the purpose of, it accomplishes 3 things. 1, exposes us to Protagoras in the way that the Sophists saw themselves in general. 2, it exposes us to Plato's writings, which is one of our major resources for putting a bunch of this stuff together anyways. And 3, it's going to expose us to the character of Socrates. And so we're going to get an early taste of Socrates because Socrates is largely arguing with the Sophists. And so it's kind of hard to just talk about the Sophists without also bringing up Socrates. So we'll do an in-depth dive into Socrates, but we'll be introducing him here. Make sense? Okay, so now we're going to start on this dialogue, Protagoras. Now this dialogue, Socrates is the one speaking. So Plato wrote it. It's Socrates speaking. Socrates is talking to someone about a time that a friend of his woke him up out of bed because a sophist was in town. So Hippocrates comes to Socrates, says, "Hey, Protagoras is in town. Will you please come speak with him on my behalf and convince him to take me on as a student?" So Socrates is going, and he's going to where Protagoras is staying, and he's trying to convince Protagoras to take on Hippocrates as a student. Now, these sophists, they travel all over Athens. What happens is they kind of agree amongst each other to come stay in one place at a time, and they're usually hosted by some wealthy man. So they all come stay in one place together. They can all put on a show, fighting for the youth of Athens or whatever cities that they're in, to try and get new students. And so that's what we're going to see in action. So jumping into the dialogue. So it starts with the youth, Hippocrates, asking Socrates to accompany him to speak with Protagoras and to convince him to take on Hippocrates as his pupil. So Hippocrates, he's one of these young youths. He's got some money. He wants to pay someone to teach him how to be persuasive. And it's so bad, Socrates was sleeping, and he barges into his house and wakes him up and says, "Let's go." Socrates has to tell him, "Wait for a second. Take it easy. Let's wait for Protagoras to actually wake up, and then we'll go." But eventually, they venture to where Protagoras is staying. And Socrates, speaking to Protagoras on Hippocrates' behalf, says he would like to know what will happen to him, Hippocrates, if he associates with you, Protagoras. So he's asking Protagoras, what's going to happen to Hippocrates if you take him on as a student? So Protagoras replies, "Young man, if you associate with me, on the very first day, you will return home a better man than you came, and a better on the second day than on the first, and a better every day than you were on the day before. So you're going to improve every day." Now Socrates points out that's kind of vague. If he went and he was studying with some sculptor, every day you would expect him to get a little bit better at sculpting. So what exactly are you going to make him better at, Protagoras? How are you going to improve him? So Socrates presses Socrates presses him, asking in what respect Hippocrates will be improved. He wants Protagoras to be more specific. So Protagoras responds, if Hippocrates comes to me, he will not experience a sort of drudgery with which other sophists are in the habit of insulting their pupils. Now, he's giving this conversation in public. All the other sophists are right there. So they're all sitting in a hall ready to have a nice discussion and listen in on a discussion. So he's definitely insulting his competition and trying to tell other young men listening, I'm the one you should come to, not them. So, insulting their pupils, who, when they have just escaped from the arts, so they've just finished their basic education, and now they're ready for the more advanced education of the sophists, when they have just escaped from the arts, are taken and driven back into them by these teachers, who made to learn calculation, and astronomy, and geometry, and music. But if he comes to me, he will learn that which he comes to learn, and this is prudence in affairs private as well as public. He will learn to order his house in the best manner, and he will be able to speak and act for the best in the affairs of the state. In short, after Socrates questions him more, he claims to be able to teach men virtue. Because he thinks that this is what makes you good at running your own household. Understand that these men would have large households, a lot of side businesses going on. But also they think that this is what makes you function well in the state. Pericles would have been viewed as a very virtuous man to these guys. And the 5 virtues that they're targeting here are justice, temperance, courage, wisdom, and piety/holiness. Now in this dialogue, they're going to talk about these 5 virtues. These 4 over here are often referred to as the 4 chief virtues, and they never die out of philosophy. So 4 chief virtues, justice, temperance, courage, wisdom. This one happens to have that 5th one. All right, so that's what he claims to be able to do. Essentially teach virtue. Socrates demurs, saying that he doubts virtue can be taught. So now they're going to have a conversation. Is it possible to even teach people virtue? So here's why Socrates explained why he doesn't think he can teach virtue. When we are met together in the assembly, meaning all of Athens comes together in the assembly to talk about the issues of the city. When we are gathered together in the assembly, and the matter in hand relates to building, the builders are summoned as advisors. When the question is one of shipbuilding, the shipwrights, and the like of other arts, which they think capable of being taught and learned. If others advise, they are mocked. So when the city's thinking about some particular thing that can be taught, we're always going to find the experts to speak on that. If the city's debating building a wall and how they should do it, they only let the builders talk. If everyone knows you're not an expert builder and you get up to talk, they're all going to mock you and say, sit down. You don't know what you're talking about. This is their way of behaving about professors of the arts. But when the question is an affair of the state, when we're talking about some law, whether some law is just, then everybody is free to have a say. Evidently because they, the assembly, are under the impression that this sort of knowledge cannot be taught. And so there are no experts, and so everyone's opinion is equally valid. So that's what Socrates says. He has a second point. Socrates goes on to say that the best and wisest of our citizens are unable to impart their political wisdom to others, pointing out that good men often have bad sons, and also vice versa. And so that's his second argument for it not being teachable. If virtue is teachable, how is it that someone like Marcus Aurelius has a Commodus as a son? Shouldn't Marcus Aurelius have had the best son there could be if virtue could be taught? So that's the second piece of his argument. So Protagoras is going to counter this argument. What's his counter? Protagoras explains that if every man was an engineer, they would all be welcome to speak on matters of engineering. So let's say that we were all engineers. Some of us were more expert than others, but we were still discussing something of engineering. We would still allow everyone to speak. Even though some are more expert and some are less expert, we're all experts, and we understand it. So we're all able to speak on matters of engineering. The reason why any man will be listened to when it comes to political virtues is because every man has a share of this virtue to some degree. He's going to argue that we're pretty much all experts in this, and some are just more expert than others. So it's not that no one's an expert of political virtue, it's that everyone's an expert of political virtue, is what Protagoras is going to be arguing here. Consider when men act unjust. Here's a second argument. In such cases, any man will be angry with another and reprimand him, clearly because he thinks that by study and learning, the virtue in which the other is deficient may be acquired. In punishing injustice, he has regard to the future, and is desirous that the man who is punished, and is desirous that the man who is punished, and he who sees him punished, may be deterred from doing wrong again. He punishes for the sake of prevention, thereby clearly implying that virtue is capable of being taught. If I can change your behavior by showing you something, obviously I can teach you to behave different. That's a large part of what our judicial system is all about. Training people to be virtuous. So he says, everyone's an expert. Furthermore, here's how you teach them all the time. It's happening left and right. In regards to the sons of good men failing to seem good, this is simply because we compare them to fellow citizens, all of whom are experts. And the analogy he gives is, imagine that you live in a city where everyone dedicates their life to becoming flute players. And you're all trying to be expert flute players. So if that's what we're all trying to do, now imagine that in this city-state, my dad's an expert flute player, but I happen to be an average flute player. There's nothing surprising about that. Just because your parent was a prodigy doesn't mean you'll be a prodigy. And vice versa. Maybe your dad wasn't a very good flute player, but you're a prodigy. And you just had a natural talent for it early on in life. And so there's nothing surprising about prodigies having sons who aren't quite prodigies, and they're just average at flute playing, and average flute players being able to have these prodigies. So he says that there's nothing surprising about that. The mere fact that they are able to function in a political society demonstrates that they must possess political virtue. It takes political virtue even to function in city-states the way that we do. So we must possess it, especially as compared to the barbarians, who lack it.
Barbarians as in what?
Barbarians as in people not living together in organized cities. They seem to lack that political virtue. Furthermore, if we lived in a society where everyone was taught, we already gave that example. In a similar manner, all men are teachers of virtue. Oh, I skipped something. Oh no, right. In a similar manner, all men are teachers of virtue, and each one learns and teaches according to his ability. Asking who teaches men virtue is like asking who teaches men the Greek language, or in our case, English. Who taught you English? Everyone did, kind of. You're surrounded by experts of English, and everyone's teaching you English. There's nothing surprising about some of us being better, some of us being worse, but we're all able to use it pretty well. We're all experts in English. So that's Protagoras' counter-argument. Protagoras goes on to explain that while anyone is capable of teaching virtue, occasionally there may be one who is just slightly better at teaching than the rest, such as one Protagoras thinks he is. Hey, you're all good at teaching, I just happen to be a bit better than you all. So, here's what he says. A teacher of this sort I believe myself to be, and above all other men, to have the knowledge which makes a man noble and good. And I give my pupils their money's worth, and even more, as they themselves confess. And therefore I have introduced the following mode of payment. When a man has been my pupil, if he likes, he pays my price. But there's no compulsion. And if he does not like, he has only to go to a temple and take an oath of the value of my instructions, and he pays no more than he declares to be the value of my teaching, to be their value. So this concludes his argument that virtue may be taught. Now, Socrates loves a speech. He stops, he thinks about it for a while, and then decides to praise him a little bit. O son of Apollodorus. Apollodorus is the father of Hippocrates, who he's here on behalf of. So, he's here for the son of Apollodorus. O son of Apollodorus, how deeply grateful I am for you having brought me hither. I would not have missed the speech of Protagoras for a great deal, for I used to imagine that no human care could make men good, but I know better now. Yet I still have one very small difficulty, with which I am sure that Protagoras will easily explain. That one small difficulty takes up the rest of the dialogue, as he has already explained so much. Now, I want you to tell me, truly, whether virtue is one whole, of which justice and temperance and holiness are parts, or whether all these are only the names of one and the same thing. That is a doubt which still lingers in my mind. So, are all the virtues really one and the same thing, or are they separate things? Protagoras claims that they are parts of virtue, and that it's possible for a man to be courageous and yet not just, or just yet not wise. So we have these virtues that they're talking about, these 5 virtues. So that's what the conversation is going to turn to from here. They're going to talk about whether or not these virtues are really one and the same, or whether they're actually different. So Protagoras thinks they're all the same. Socrates now gives us counter-argument. Socrates then begins his counter-argument. Since the virtues are parts only, then they are different from each other and not the same as each other. There are things that are just, and nothing is more just than justice. And there are things that are holy, and nothing is more holy than holiness. If something is not just, then it's unjust. And if something is not holy, then it is unholy. So going through Socrates' argument here, he's going to argue that they have to be the same thing. Then since justice and holiness are different from each other, then the just cannot be entirely holy. For then it would be holiness. If something's entirely holy, it's holiness. So if justice and holiness are different from each other, then justice cannot be entirely holy. For then it would be holiness. And so it must be, in some sense, unholy. Similarly, the holy cannot be entirely just. For then it would be justice. And so it must be unjust to some extent. Now Socrates believes it's absurd to think that the holy could be unjust, or that the just could be unholy. Could just action ever be unholy, or holy action ever be unjust? That's what he's saying. So they must be the same. Protagoras doesn't like calling the just holy and the holy just. He'd prefer to say that they only bear a slight resemblance to each other. Socrates is absolutely shocked by this. And he feels like he's trying to frustrate Protagoras in the way that he's coming with his argument. So he's going to take a step back and come at the argument a whole new way, trying to kind of re-ease into the argument. He's a bit younger than Protagoras, by the way. There's probably like a 20 to 30 year gap between them. And so he's trying to be very respectful of Protagoras here and not offend him too much. So he comes at the argument from a whole new angle. Restart. And he says to Protagoras, observe that wisdom is virtue, and that's opposite is folly. Protagoras accepts that. And so he now walks him through an argument. Now, people who act according to the virtue of temperance are acting temperately. If you're acting according to temperance, you're acting temperately. Those who act temperately act rightly and towards their advantage. If you're acting temperately, you're acting rightly, and you're acting towards your advantage. Now, those who act wrongly or towards their disadvantage are acting foolishly, right? Pretty foolish thing to do. However, those who act wrongly or towards their disadvantage are also acting intemperately. That's just contrapositive of what was said here. Thus, when people act intemperately, they are also acting foolishly. Right?
Yep.
And so acting temperately is the opposite of acting foolishly. Now he goes on. Now consider the swift and the slow, the strong and the weak, the beautiful and the ugly, the good and the evil, and how they are all opposites of each other. And observe that that which is done swiftly is swift, and that which is done slowly is slow, and so on for all the opposites. Finally, observe that everything has only one opposite, and that which is done in opposite ways is done by opposites. Since acting foolishly and acting temperately are opposites, then folly and temperance are opposites. But where we started this whole thing was saying that folly is also the opposite of wisdom. So since the opposite of both wisdom and temperance, since folly is the opposite of both wisdom and temperance, and since everything can only have one opposite, wisdom and temperance must be the same. You follow that argument?
Yeah.
Here's wisdom, its opposite is folly. Here's temperance, he showed its opposite is folly. These are opposites, these are opposites. But everything can only have one opposite. So these two have to actually be the same. So again, there's the second argument. Now that was a summary of it. Me summarizing, give you some of his language here to give you a sense of what's called the Socratic method. So this is Socrates actually questioning him. So Socrates questioning, Protagoras answering. Give you a sense of the Socratic method. Do you admit the existence of folly? I do. And is not wisdom the very opposite of folly? That is true, he said. And when men act rightly and advantageously, they seem to you to be temperate. Yes, he said. And temperance makes them temperate? Certainly. And they who do not act rightly act foolishly, and in acting thus are not temperate? I agree, he said. Then to act foolishly is the opposite of acting temperately. He assented. And foolish actions are done by folly, and temperate actions done by temperance. He agreed. And that is done strongly, which is done by strength, and that which is done weakly, done by weakness. He assented. He goes on with his opposites here. I kind of summarized all that. To which the only opposite is evil. There is no other. So you can see his questioning style here. Drilling him down. I gave you a high-level version of the argument. We'll finish up the next slide. This is all there is to it, summarizing that other argument. Then every opposite has one opposite only and no more. He assented. Then now, I said, let us recapitulate our admissions. First of all, we admitted that everything has one opposite and not more than one. We did so. And we admitted also that what was done in opposite ways was done by opposites. Yes. And that which was done foolishly, as we further admitted, was done in the opposite way to that which was done temperately. Yes. And that which was done temperately was done by temperance, and that which was done foolishly by folly. He agreed. And that which was done in opposite ways is done by opposites. Yes. And one thing is done by temperance, and quite another thing by folly. Yes. And in opposite ways, certainly. And therefore by opposites. Then folly is the opposite of temperance, clearly. And do you remember that folly has already been acknowledged by us to be the opposite of wisdom? He assented. And we said that everything has only one opposite? Yes. And so he takes him step by step, forcing him to come to the conclusion that he ultimately wanted him to come to. So that's the Socratic method. And that's often what they also mean by the dialectic method at this time, the method of questioning and answering. So now, at this point, Socrates has shown that justice and holiness are the same, and that wisdom and temperance are the same. Remember, he's trying to show that all 5 virtues are the same. That's the point here. So he showed that justice and temperance, not justice and temperance, justice and holiness, we'll do an H for P for piety is what I was trying to think, but okay. So he showed that these two were the same, and now he's already shown that, we just really did wisdom and what? Temperance. We just really showed that those are the same. So the last one that we need to tie into this whole thing is courage. If we can somehow tie courage into the rest of this, then we've shown that all 5 virtues are really the same, shown that they're all logically equivalent. So that's big picture of what he's doing in this dialogue. And so far we've made this link and this link. Now, Protagoras, after losing 2 times, is getting a bit annoyed. At this point, Protagoras is starting to become annoyed with Socrates and looking for a way to get out of the argument. As Socrates begins questioning again, in reply to a question about whether or not the good... Sorry, let me say this differently. So Socrates is starting his questioning again, and so he asks Protagoras a question about whether or not the good is that which is expedient for man. Now, Protagoras is going to use one of his standard sophist tricks. When a sophist gets stuck in an argument and they don't know what to do, what they instead do is look for some hook that one of their memorized speeches can go off on. And now Socrates has touched on a topic that Protagoras has memorized a good speech for. Namely, what is expedient? And so Protagoras is going to give one of his standard sophist speeches. I know of many things, meats, drinks, medicines, and tens of thousands of other things, which are inexpedient for man, and some which are expedient, and some which are neither expedient nor inexpedient for man, but only for horses, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and he goes on and on. I removed a bunch of it. Or I may instance olive oil, which is mischievous to all plants, and generally most injurious to the hair of every animal, with the exception of man, but beneficial to human hair, and to the human body generally. And even in this application, so various and changeable is the nature of the benefit, that which is the greatest good to the outward parts of man is a very great evil to the inward parts. For this reason, physicians always forbid their patients the use of oil in their food, except in very small quantities, just enough to extinguish the disagreeable sensation of the smell of the meat and the sauce. So he goes off, showing off all these different things that he knows. He gives this great speech in reply to Socrates' one little question. And after he gives this great speech, remember, they're in a big hall, all the sophists are all there watching. There's all this applause for Protagoras' great speech. And so Socrates has to wait for the applause to die down, the conversation to resume, and what's Socrates hoping like? He tells Protagoras, I have a wretched memory, and when anyone makes a long speech to me, I never remember what he is talking about. So when you do this, Protagoras, I lose track of the argument we even had to begin with. So Socrates requests that Protagoras try to keep his reply simpler, or otherwise Socrates had better be off. He talks about how he has other business to attend to and can't just stay here. So if it's not going to be a productive conversation, I'd best go off. He also pokes a little bit of fun at Protagoras, because Protagoras claims to be this great orator who can give great long speeches as well as short, concise speeches. So he says, why don't you use this other way that you claim you know how to use? Keep your answers short and simple. So he's getting ready to leave. It's obvious Protagoras doesn't want to continue the conversation. But the company there, everyone viewing this, The company plead with him to stay, and they press Socrates and Protagoras to compromise so that the conversations may continue. And so they ultimately come to an agreement, okay, we'll continue the conversation, but this time it's Protagoras' turn to question Socrates. And Socrates now has to do some of the answering rather than all the questioning. So the conversations continues with Protagoras drilling Socrates about some poem. He picks a poem that he thinks Socrates will think is good. He thinks he has some trap for him inside the poem. Socrates ends up working his way out of the trap, and it doesn't really go that well for Protagoras. When that's all said and done, they get back to the conversation. And it's Socrates' turn to drill him again. So Socrates then asks if Protagoras still thinks the virtues are many, to which he replies that wisdom, justice, temperance, and piety may all be the same, but that courage is for sure something different. So somewhere in that conversation, I can't remember which two he links, but he links two of these together. And so now we just have courage all by itself. And so this is the last one Socrates is going to try to link. He's ultimately going to link it with wisdom. So Socrates then goes on to prove that courage and wisdom are the same. Just a taste of it, what he's doing here. And the courageous man has no base fears or base confidences. True, he replied. And if not base, then honorable. He admits this. And if honorable, then good. Yes. But the fear and confidence of the coward is foolhardy But the fear or confidence of the coward or the foolhardy or madman, on the contrary, are base, he assented. And these base fears and confidences originate in ignorance and uninstructedness. True, he said. And so he's going to tie being a coward to being ignorant and being courageous to being wise. And ultimately, Protagoras is going to give them enough ground that they can come to the conclusion that, okay, courage is the same as wisdom. That's the way the argument leads. Eventually, Protagoras refuses to keep answering the questions, and he has to finish on his own. And so, end of the dialogue. Socrates makes a joke about how him and Protagoras throughout this whole argument have kind of switched sides. Socrates started out claiming that none of the virtues can be taught, and yet he claims that all the virtues are wisdom, which if anything can be taught, it's knowledge, wisdom. Yet Protagoras is over here claiming that he can teach all the virtues, and now he won't give Socrates an inch. And he will say, no, wisdom is not the same as all the other virtues. So that's what he's going to remark on here. So he's speaking from the perspective of the argument, as though it was commentating on Protagoras and Socrates. So, from the position of the argument, Protagoras and Socrates, you are strange beings. There are you, Socrates, who were saying that virtue cannot be taught, contradicting yourself now, by your attempt to prove that all things are knowledge, including justice and temperance and courage, which tends to show that virtue can certainly be taught, for if virtue were other than knowledge, as Protagoras attempted to prove, then clearly virtue cannot be taught. But if virtue is entirely knowledge, as you are seeking to show, then I cannot but suppose that virtue is capable of being taught. Protagoras, on the other hand, who started by saying that it might be taught, is now eager to prove it to be anything rather than knowledge. And if this is true, it must be quite incapable of being taught, if it's not knowledge. So, Socrates wants Protagoras to keep working with him on the argument. He doesn't like that they've come to this condition, and so he wants to keep attacking the argument. Say, which of us is right, which of us is wrong? What's the right position? Well, Protagoras has had enough. So his final reply to Socrates. Socrates, I am not of a base nature, and I am the last man in the world to be envious. I cannot but applaud your energy and your conduct of an argument. As I have often said, I admire you above all men whom I know, and far above all men of your age. Remember, there's a good age gap between them. And I believe that you will become very eminent in philosophy. Let's come back to this subject at some future time. At present, we had better turn to something else. So, he's done. Socrates' final words, by all means, I said, if that is your wish. For I too ought long since to have kept an engagement, of which I spoke before, and I only tarried because I could not refuse the request of the noble Callias, that's whose home they're at. So the conversation ended, and we went our way. And that's the end of that first dialogue, giving you a good taste of Protagoras. Okay, any questions about that dialogue? And that gives you kind of a sense of how I'll cover the next two dialogues that I intend to do as well with each of these guys. Okay, so that's a dialogue that was giving you a sense of one of our primary sources from which we actually get the information that we try and reconstruct these people from. So now I'm going to cover Protagoras. I'm going to cover him the way we cover most philosophers. So kind of a reset button now on Protagoras. So I gave you the dialogue, kind of a reset on Protagoras. Now we're just going to cover his philosophy from a high-level view. Make sense? Okay, Protagoras. Now, if he's famous for anything, he's famous for this statement. Man is the measure of all things. Of things that are, that they are. Of things that are not, that they are not. There is no objective, absolute reality. How are things actually? However, man measures them. So you see here how he's going to be the first one to start pushing this new skeptic way of thinking. About the gods, I'm not able to know whether they exist or do not exist, nor what they are like in form. For the factors preventing knowledge are many, the obscurity of the subject, and the shortness of human life. Now this is one of the things that they targeted him for being an atheist with when Athens ultimately turned on him and burned all the stuff. That's the line, supposedly. From Diogenes Laertius. He was the first to maintain that in every experience, there are two logi, or arguments, in opposition to each other. So he was the first one to put forth this notion that, pick any subject, there's equally good arguments on either side of the argument. So how can you come to know what's true? Now, apparently, he didn't have very high regard for mathematics, so that might have helped his view a little bit, I don't know. And you got a little bit of that in the Protagoras Dialogue. He's telling his students, I won't waste your time with all these arts. We'll go straight to teaching you how to be persuasive. So, whatever seems to me to be at any given moment is, and what seems not to be is not. The fact that it may seem otherwise to me later, or to another now, indicates that no truth is possible, and that every judgment is opinion at best. So that's what he thinks. Gives you some examples of these. Consider a breeze. So, set up a scenario. Here I am, I just got out of the pool on a hot summer day, there's a breeze blowing. I feel the breeze, I say, oh, how warm, as it's warming up my body. You, on the other hand, who have just been running a mile, you feel it might be cooling you down. You might say, oh, how cool. Same breeze, two completely different experiences. Which is it? Man is the measure. Or the hot-cold example that we always give. You got the 3 jugs of water, one's at boiling point, one's at freezing point, the other one's room temperature. You go from the hot to the cold, or to the room temperature, you say, ah, how cool. You go from the cold to the room temperature, you say, ah, how warm. What is it really? Man is the measure. It's hot for you now, and it's cold for you now. There's no sense in talking about what it really is. It is whatever you measure it to be. Man is the measure. So, talk about the breeze. Note that to say that conflicting statements on the same thing are equally and simultaneously true is an assault on the principle of contradiction. So Protagoras now is making a flat-out assault on contradiction. Right? If you and I have completely opposite positions on the exact same thing, I say it's A, you say it's not A, he's saying they're both simultaneously equally validly true. And so he starts that way of thinking. From the invalidity of the senses is ultimately what his argument comes from. So, something from Aristotle. We observe, this is him commenting on Protagoras. We observe next that if all contradictions were true at the same time, of the same thing, it is clear that all things would be one. For if anything may be affirmed or denied of everything, as those who must maintain, who say what Protagoras says, then the same thing would be a trireme, a wall, and a man. All these things would really be the same thing. For if someone should hold that a man is not a trireme, clearly he is not a trireme, right? Because you're the measure. Then, if the contradiction may also be true, he's also a trireme. So am I the same thing as that door? You say yes, then I'm the same thing as that door. If you say no, well, we also allow the contradiction. So I am the same thing as the door. So it's one of the ways that Aristotle points out, if you ever build up a system of philosophy that allows contradictions, it turns into pure nonsense. Like everything could really be argued to be the same thing.
Isn't that what Parmenides thought?
That's funny. For different reasons, yes. So Parmenides, in asserting the law of contradiction, was able to come to the conclusion that everything's one thing. Parmenides, or Aristotle, in using good logic, is able to argue, no, everything is not one thing. Well, actually, all he's saying is that if you allow contradictions, then you also have to allow that everything's one thing. So you can accept there's no contradictions and still come to the conclusion that everything's one thing. But if you allow contradictions, then you have to allow that everything is one thing. And really, if you allow contradictions, I think we've already talked about it, you have to allow how everything is everything.
What do you mean by allow contradictions?
If you give me one contradiction, specifically in math, I can prove whatever you want.
Are you saying accepting the contradiction is true?
Right. If you will allow contradictions to be true in your system of thought, you can then prove anything that you want.
Yeah.
And the common example, I think we already gave it. Did we already give, if the 2 is equal to 1, I can prove whatever you want?
Yeah.
We can do it one more time. What do you want me to prove? Anything outrageous?
Sky is purple.
And the sky is purple? That's not outrageous enough. I'm going to prove I'm in the center of the sun.
Okay.
All right. We're going to allow 2 equals 1. I'm going to prove to you I'm in the center of the sun. All right. The number of people in the center of the sun is 0. I guess we'll just prove that there's someone in the center of the sun. Tying it to me, that will be a lot of work. We can do it, but it's more work than that's worth. So we'll just prove someone's in the center of the sun. We'll prove there's a purple elephant in the center of the sun. There we go. Keep it fun. The number of purple elephants in the center of the sun is 0, right?
Yep.
Now, if 2 is equal to 1, subtract 1 from both sides, and what do we get? 1 is equal to 0. So the number of purple elephants in the center of the sun is 0. But 0 is equal to 1. So the number of purple elephants in the center of the sun is 1. So there's a purple elephant in the center of the sun.
There's 2.
Yeah, how'd you know? There's a lot more than that too. And there's a lot less than that. In fact, there's a negative number of purple elephants in the center of the sun. However, that even makes sense. Right. So when you allow contradictions into whatever axiomatic system you're building up, you can prove anything. Turns into a bunch of nonsense. Okay. So Protagoras, since he's the first of these sophists, he's the one starting this skeptic shift that's happening in Greece. He's one of the people at the forefront of this skeptic shift, moving towards skepticism. So Protagoras starts the assault on the possibility of objective and absolute knowledge, of being a skeptic. While he cannot teach knowledge, he can teach the art of persuasion, the technique of leading others to accept one's own view. In doing so, he teaches how contradictory propositions can be shown to be equally true and equally false. This way, his students are prepared to argue either side of an argument. So always train you to argue for whatever would. It's like, decide what truth would be most advantageous for you now. That's why I need to teach you how to be able to argue. Because when you're standing there in the assembly, it doesn't matter what's actually true. All that matters is what you can convince people is true. So pick the truth that works best for you and convince them that that is in fact the truth. And they'll all accept it too.
That's what he's promoting?
Kind of.
Okay.
In fact, he would say it's like making it the most popular truth. Because what's true, it's how you measure it. So I've got to just convince you all to measure this truth to be the right truth. And then it is the right truth for all of you. Because that's the way you're measuring it now. And maybe it will be the wrong truth for you a little bit down the road when it has disastrous results. But at that time, it was the right truth for you. Man is a measure. So, according to Aristotle, this style of teaching did not involve reasoning, but rather focused on grammar and wordplay. Give you an example of one of these types of arguments a sophist would use. So I'm talking to you, and I find out that you have a dog that just had puppies. So I say, you have a dog. Yes. And your dog had puppies? Yes. So your dog's a father? Yes. So the dog's yours? Yeah. And it's a father? Yeah. So it's your father. And its puppies are your brothers and sisters. That was an example of the sophistical type of wordplay that they would try to use to get the conclusion that they wanted. Where each little piece of it, you're kind of just saying yes, 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 and you're like, wait a minute, no, we messed something up, let's go back, say that again. That's the type of wordplay they would use. Not that straightforward, right? Try to be more subtle about it. That insidious type of reasoning where you're not really sure what went wrong. To give you a sophistical argument, I think I gave you one at the start of the year, right? What's negative 1 equal to? It's equal to negative 1 to the power of 1, which is equal to negative 1 to the power of 2 over 2, right? 1's the same thing as 2 over 2. Okay, this is the same thing as negative 1 squared, splitting up our exponents, squared in 1/2. Remember, when you split up exponents, that's the same thing as multiplying them together. Sorry, this is a 2 over 2. So we can split it up into 2 and 1/2, right? No cheats there. 1/2, that's the same thing as taking the square root. So this is the square root of -1 squared. What's -1 times -1? 1. So this is just the square root of 1. What's the square root of 1? 1. Oh, look at that. -1 is equal to 1. A good sophistical argument using mathematics. So just doing that with wordplay, where each little point, you only really got to twist it at one point, and then kind of just slowly walk up through it with a bunch of things that seem like they make sense.
Do you eventually plan on telling us where we're
Did we not go over why I cheated?
every time you bring this up?
Every time, yeah.
That keeps as a great example.
Keep it.
Here's the cheat.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
Because if you take each side of an expression to the 1/2 power, you have to introduce a plus minus.
Yeah.
Oh,
And so then it's plus minus, and so then it's plus minus. And so -1 is equal to plus or minus 1, which is true.
Yeah,
In that case, it's a negative case.
gotcha.
But you can see how with enough wordplay, you can create these sophistical arguments. And so Aristotle had a book on, what is it called? On sophistical refutation, going over sophistical arguments. So he has a lot to say about these guys. Anyways, that ends Protagoras. Moving on